A man stands in a workshop in Nazareth, hands rough with stone dust, and somewhere a boy is learning to work beside him. Centuries later, that same man will be painted in stained glass with a halo and a chisel for wood he probably never touched. We are going to spend the next while taking apart 10 things that almost everyone, including many lifelong believers, simply assumes about Jesus of Nazareth. None of this is an attack on the Gospels. It is the opposite. Almost every correction we are about to walk through comes directly from reading the text more closely, not less closely. Most people think they know this story. What they actually know is the story as it has been retold, simplified, and occasionally invented over 2,000 years of tradition, translation, and well-meaning art. We are going to walk through it one piece at a time, in order, and see what is actually sitting in the original languages and the historical record. Let us start at the beginning, literally with his name. His name was not Jesus, not in the way you are picturing it as you read those 4 letters. When the angel Gabriel comes to Joseph and tells him what to name Mary's son, the name being given is a Hebrew name, and it is the same name carried by Joshua, the successor of Moses in the book of Exodus. In Hebrew it is pronounced Yeshua. Some render it Yehoshua, some Yeshua. The differences are dialectal, not theological. And here is the detail that changes everything. The name does not just mean something nice. The Hebrew root behind it is Yasha, which means to save, to deliver, to rescue. So when the angel tells Joseph what to call the child, in Matthew chapter 1, he is essentially saying, name him the Lord saves, because that is exactly what this child is going to do. This is not a footnote. This is the entire mission statement of the gospel, embedded in a name before the child has said a single word. So how does Yeshua become Jesus? This is where geography and grammar conspire against us. The Gospels were not written in Hebrew. They were written in Greek, because Greek was the common language of literate people across the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1st century. A holdover from Alexander's empire centuries earlier, still functioning as the educated person's second language, even under Roman rule. And Greek has a problem. It has no sound for the Hebrew letters that make up the middle and end of Yeshua. There is no sh sound in classical Greek, so the shin becomes a simple sigma, an S. And there is no equivalent at all for the final letter, the ayin, a sound that does not really exist in Greek or Latin. So Greek scribes did what they always did, with Hebrew names ending in that sound. Solomon, in Hebrew Shlomo, becomes Solomon. Samuel, in Hebrew Shmuel, becomes Samuel. And Yeshua becomes Iesus, pronounced something like Jesus. Move that into Latin, where Jerome translates the Greek New Testament at the end of the 4th century, and Iesus becomes Iesus. Move it into English centuries later, where the letter J eventually takes over the sound that E used to carry at the start of a word, and Iesus becomes Jesus. Same person, same name really, just dragged through 3 languages that were never built to hold the sounds it started with. There is no scandal here, just translation, doing exactly what translation does. Now here is something most people never realize about his family's trade. The Gospels tell us that Joseph, and later Jesus himself, were a tekton. That is the Greek word sitting behind every English Bible's word carpenter. And tekton is a much wider word than carpenter. In classical Greek, a tekton is a builder, a craftsman, someone who works in wood, in stone, sometimes even in metal. It is the root behind our English word architect, which literally means chief builder. Outside the Gospels, in the Greek Old Testament, the same word describes the men who worked on Solomon's temple and on David's house. And it shows up for craftsmen working in bronze and iron as well as wood. Think about the terrain. 1st century Galilee was not heavily forested. It was a land of limestone hills, and most ordinary homes were built from stone, not timber. Wood was for doors, beams, and furniture, not the structure of a house. So when Matthew and Mark call Joseph a tekton, the most historically plausible picture is a general builder, someone equally at home, shaping stone as he was working wood, the first-century equivalent of a small construction contractor rather than a man who only built cabinets. And here is what actually matters more than any of that. Whatever his trade in his youth, by the time the Gospels pick up his public life, Jesus is not building anything. He has become an itinerant teacher and healer, walking from village to village. The workshop in Nazareth shaped his hands. It did not define his calling. If you have ever pictured Jesus as simply, uncomplicatedly gentle, the text is going to push back on you here. We are not saying Jesus was cruel. We are saying the Gospels do not present a man who was only soft. Read the Sermon on the Mount, and you will find warmth, mercy, an invitation to the weary. Read Matthew chapter 23, and you will find Jesus calling the religious leaders of his day a brood of vipers, comparing them to beautifully decorated tombs that are full of dead men's bones on the inside. That is not gentle language. That is the language of someone who has had enough of religious performance covering for spiritual rot. And in private, talking to his own disciples, the men who had left everything to follow him, he does not always flatter them either. The Greek phrase is oligopistoi, literally little faiths, and it shows up again and again in the Gospels as his nickname for the 12 when their trust runs thin. So where does the gentle Jesus, meek and mild image actually come from? Almost certainly from two real qualities the Gospels do attribute to him consistently: a fierce commitment to justice and an unmistakable tenderness toward the poor, the sick, and the socially discarded. When a crowd is ready to stone a woman caught in adultery, he says, "Let the one among you who has never sinned throw the first stone," and the crowd disperses. That is gentleness toward the vulnerable. It is not softness in general. The two are not the same thing, and the Gospels never confuse them. Jesus reserves his sharpest words for people with power who use it to crush people without it. That is not a contradiction in his character. That is the character. And it is not actually a new character. Read the prophet Isaiah, and you find the same combination centuries earlier. A God who is described as defending the orphan and the widow with one breath and pronouncing judgment on corrupt rulers with the next. Read Amos, and you find the same pairing: tenderness toward the exploited poor, sitting right next to thunderous condemnation of the merchants who exploit them. Jesus is not inventing a new kind of moral seriousness when he overturns tables in the temple courts or calls out religious leaders in public. He is stepping directly into a much older prophetic pattern, the same one that produced Isaiah and Amos and Jeremiah, where mercy toward the powerless and confrontation with the powerful have always been two sides of a single conviction, not two different personalities competing for control of the same man. Here is a claim you hear surprisingly often, usually meant kindly, that Muslims believe in the same Jesus Christians do. There is real overlap, and it is worth naming honestly before we name the difference. In the Quran, Jesus appears under the name Isa. He is born of the Virgin Mary. He performs miracles. He is honored as a prophet. That is not nothing. But the distance between the two pictures is enormous once you look closely. For Christians, when Jesus speaks, the claim of the Gospels is that God himself is speaking, because the Gospels present Jesus as divine, the Word made flesh, in the language of John chapter 1. In the Quran, Isa is a created being, a prophet among prophets, never God. And the difference does not stop there. Islamic tradition does not affirm that Jesus died on a cross at all. Without a crucifixion, there is no Easter morning to speak of, because there is nothing to rise from. In Islamic theology, a true prophet of God is not permitted to suffer that kind of defeat. So tradition holds that someone else was substituted at the last moment, or that Jesus was taken up before the crucifixion occurred. The Gospels run in exactly the opposite direction. Defeat, real death, is the hinge the entire story turns on, precisely because what follows it is resurrection. Two faiths can honor the same name and still be telling two fundamentally different stories. This is one of those places. Here is a small mercy and a small disappointment, depending on how you feel about it. Jesus did not have flowing blonde hair and pale skin. That image, the soft focus, golden-haired figure you have seen on 1,000 church walls, owes far more to centuries of European religious art than to first-century Judea. Christians around the world have long pictured Jesus in their own image, painting him as an African man in parts of Africa, as an Asian man in parts of Korea and China. Not to deceive anyone, but because the point of the image was always nearness, helping people feel that this man's life touched their own. The honest truth is that the Gospels give us no physical description of Jesus at all. None. Not his height, not his hair, not the color of his eyes. What we do know, from archaeology and from skeletal remains recovered from first-century Judea, is what an ordinary Galilean Jewish man of that period likely looked like. Forensic reconstructions based on those remains suggest a shorter, sturdier build than later Western art imagined. A broader nose, an olive complexion, and short hair, since long hair on men was unusual in that culture and context, not the cultural norm artists later assumed. It is a small study, built from a handful of skulls, and no one should treat it as a photograph. But it points in a direction worth sitting with. Jesus almost certainly looked like an ordinary first-century Galilean Jewish workman, because that is exactly what, by trade and by birth, he was. Now we come to one of the most beloved images in the entire Christian imagination, and it needs more care than it usually gets. Jesus was not born in a stable, at least not in the way that phrase makes you picture it. Luke's Gospel does say that the newborn was placed in a manger, a feeding trough, and it does say that there was no room for the family in something Luke calls a kataluma. Tradition filled in the rest: an ox and a donkey, a lonely barn on the edge of town, an innkeeper who turned a pregnant woman away at the door. None of that second part is actually in the text. Here is what most people miss about that Greek word kataluma. Luke uses a completely different word, pandokeon, when he wants to describe an actual commercial inn, the kind of place where a stranger pays for a bed. He uses that word later, in the parable of the Good Samaritan. But for the birth of Jesus, he chooses kataluma, the same word he later uses for a guest room attached to a private home. First-century Judean village houses were typically single-story buildings with two areas: an upper, family living space, and a lower level at the same end of the house where the family's animals were brought in overnight for warmth and safety, with a feeding trough built right into the floor where the two levels met. So the most historically grounded picture is not an outdoor barn, it is a family home in Bethlehem, almost certainly belonging to relatives, where the upstairs guest room was already full, likely because of the census crowding the town, and so the family welcomed Mary and Joseph into the main downstairs living space instead, the space where the animals were also kept overnight. Mary gives birth there, in the lower room of an ordinary house, surrounded by extended family rather than strangers, and the baby is laid in the feeding trough, built into that floor, because it is the nearest thing resembling a cradle. It is a less cinematic picture than the lonely stable on a hillside. It may also be a warmer one. No cruel innkeeper ever appears in the text. He was invented later to fill a gap that the original story never actually left open. Was Jesus even a real person, or is he closer to a legend that grew in the retelling? This is worth taking seriously, because it is the rare claim on this list that people make with real confidence and very little actual research behind it. The historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth is one of the better attested facts from the ancient world outside of the Bible itself. Start with Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian, not a Christian, writing toward the end of the 1st century, who mentions Jesus twice in his work Antiquities of the Jews, including a reference to James, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, in a passage modern scholars treat as authentic. Then move to the Roman sources. The historian Tacitus, writing around the year 115, records that Christians were named after a man called Christus, who was executed by the procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, a detail that lines up precisely with the Gospel timeline. Suetonius, writing about the reign of Claudius, references disturbances in Rome connected to a figure he calls Chrestus. And Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor, writes a letter to the Emperor Trajan describing Christians who worship Christ as to a god and asks for guidance on how to handle them under Roman law. None of these men were friendly to Christianity. None of them were trying to do Christianity any favors. They simply treated Jesus the way they treated any other recent historical figure who had become inconvenient to the empire, as someone who had actually lived, actually been executed, and actually left behind a movement that refused to disappear. Here is one that tends to surprise people who picture Jesus wandering Galilee, dressed like a wandering ascetic, in plain, simple, threadbare robes. The Gospels suggest the opposite. When Roman soldiers crucify Jesus and strip him of his clothing, John's Gospel tells us they cannot bring themselves to tear his outer robe, because it was woven in one piece, seamless, and clearly worth preserving rather than dividing. So instead, the soldiers gamble for it. That single detail tells you the garment had real value. And there is a second layer here that has nothing to do with cost. The Gospels mention fringes or tassels on the corners of Jesus's outer garment. These tassels were not decoration, they were a command straight out of the book of Numbers, instructing observant Jewish men to wear tassels on the corners of their garments as a constant physical reminder of God's commandments. So Jesus was not dressed like an outsider to the religious life of his people. He was dressed, quite visibly, as an observant Jewish teacher, distinctively enough that a woman suffering from years of hemorrhaging believed simply touching the edge of his garment could heal her. And the crowd around him clearly understood that clothing to carry a kind of recognized, almost sacred authority. Far from being indifferent to dress, Jesus appears to have worn exactly what a respected rabbi of his time and culture was expected to wear. This next one resolves quickly, but it changes how you should picture every conversation in the Gospels. Jesus did not speak Hebrew as his daily language. By the 1st century, Hebrew had largely become a sacred literary language, used for reading and discussing scripture in the synagogue, not the language ordinary Galileans used at the dinner table. The everyday spoken language across Palestine, for nearly everyone, was Aramaic, a closely related Semitic language that had become dominant centuries earlier under the influence of the old Persian Empire, and it had simply never lost its grip on daily life, even after the Greeks and then the Romans took control of the region. So when you read Jesus teaching in parables, arguing with religious leaders, comforting the sick, almost all of that conversation, in real life, was happening in Aramaic. A handful of Aramaic phrases even survive untranslated in the Greek Gospels, like Talitha Kumi, little girl, get up, spoken to a dead child in Mark's Gospel, preserved exactly as Jesus said it, because the moment was simply too significant to fully translate away. And finally, the picture of Jesus as a gentle, free-spirited wanderer who rejected every institution and structure in favor of the open road. There is a real appeal to that image, especially for anyone exhausted by rigid systems and hierarchies. It is also not what the Gospels actually show you. Look closely, and you find a man who respected the religious institutions of his day, who taught regularly inside synagogues, who told his followers to honor the religious leaders' formal authority, even while criticizing their hypocrisy, and who, after all, had spent his entire life shaped by a tradition he described not as something to discard, but as something he had come to fulfill. And in his final 3 years, Jesus did something a true anti-institutional free spirit would never bother doing. He built an institution. 12 apostles, chosen deliberately and named individually, mirroring, quite deliberately, the 12 tribes of Israel, a new foundation laid directly on top of the old one. An organized system for distributing food and resources to those in need, which the book of Acts tells us required structure precise enough that disputes broke out over it, disputes serious enough that the apostles eventually had to appoint 7 men specifically to manage the daily distribution. An early and very deliberate division of labor. A treasurer, Judas, who held the funds, however that particular story ends, and after Jesus is gone, that structure does not collapse. It grows. The book of Acts shows the apostles appointing elders in every city they plant a community in, holding councils to settle theological disputes, sending official letters between congregations to keep the teaching consistent across enormous distances. None of this resembles a movement built by accident around a man who avoided structure. It resembles a man who spent his ministry deliberately building the very thing his followers would carry forward after he was gone, and who trained them well enough that the structure outlived him by 2,000 years and counting. We now call that thing the church. Jesus did not avoid institutions. He founded one, and he built it to last. So where does that leave you, 10 corrections later? Probably with a Jesus who is harder to flatten into a single comfortable image than the one you grew up picturing. A teacher who used his real name, an ordinary Hebrew name that simply traveled through Greek and Latin and English until the sounds changed, but the meaning never did. A craftsman's son who almost certainly built with stone as much as wood, before he ever built anything else with his life. A man capable of real warmth toward the broken and real severity toward the powerful, often in the same afternoon. A historical figure attested outside his own community by people who had no reason to invent him. A man dressed, born, and raised inside a specific Jewish world, not a generic, placeless figure floating above culture and history. And, in the end, a man who built something that outlasted him, rather than a wandering teacher who simply walked away from every structure he encountered. If you have ever sat in a Sunday school class or a catechism lesson and absorbed one of these 10 ideas as simple fact, you are not alone, and there is nothing embarrassing about it. Most of these traditions were not invented out of malice. They grew the way traditions usually grow, one well-meaning retelling at a time, until the retelling became the memory, and the memory became the assumption. The remarkable thing is that going back to the actual text, and to the history standing behind it, does not diminish the story. If anything, the real version is sturdier, stranger, and more specific than the softened one. And maybe that is the part that stays with me most. A faith built on an actual man, in an actual place, speaking an actual language, leaving behind an actual paper trail in the hands of people who had no interest in protecting his legacy, is not a faith that needs to be propped up by comfortable inventions. It can simply stand on what is true. If this opened up something you had never seen quite this clearly before, help us put it in front of someone else who needs it too. Subscribe, leave a comment, share it with someone who has always wondered about the man behind these stories. Pray for us. God bless you.